By early 1943, the Japanese Empire was at its height. The country had occupied Malaya and Burma, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia today. These territories had become vital sources of strategic supplies such as oil and rubber. Now the United States laid plans to roll back the Japanese gains. The aim was to cut the country's supply lines by seizing the occupied territories. Japan could then be gradually strangled to death. But to win in the vast expanse of the Pacific, the US would need to develop new forms of mobile warfare. They would be based on amphibious landings supported by aircraft flying from carriers. The Japanese, unable to match American firepower, resorted to increasingly desperate measures. The country fell back on ancient notions of military honor to create suicide units. The result would be a terrible loss of life. This would be a decisive phase in the war in the Pacific and would mark the end of Japan's dreams of empire. But this was to come. Back in the spring of 1943, the US military chiefs faced a dilemma. They had been presented with two options for the defeat of Japan. The flamboyant US Army General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the US and Australian forces in the Southwest Pacific, favored a primarily land-based route. His idea was to seize the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and the Philippines. They could then be turned into a strategic barrier that would cut off Japan from its newly conquered lands in Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Japan would be starved into surrender. Equally importantly, this plan would mean MacArthur could repay a debt. Earlier in the war, he had been kicked out of the Philippines by the Japanese, and he had promised to return to liberate the country. But the US Navy had a different idea. It would bypass the heavily defended Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and the Philippines. Instead, it would seize a string of much smaller islands scattered across the Central Pacific and close to the Japanese homeland. Rather than a barrier, the US would have a series of strategic bases from which to attack Japan's supply lines. They argued it would be swifter and much more economical. The American military command put off the decision. Both the Army and Navy were told to go ahead. In June 1943, MacArthur's plan was launched. It was called Operation Cartwheel. The first target was the major Japanese military base at Rabaul on New Britain in the Solomon Islands. It would be a two-pronged attack. The eastern prong fought its way up through New Georgia and Bougainville. the western prong battled its way through Papua New Guinea. But the virtually impenetrable jungle and unhealthy climate made progress slow. It was nearly 9 months before the pincers met, and the Japanese base at Rabaul was isolated. Meanwhile, as the US Army took control of the Solomon Islands, the US Navy mustered a mighty fleet. It included the first 4 of the brand new Essex-class aircraft carriers. They were bigger and faster than anything before. The new carriers were equipped with outstanding new planes like the Hellcat and Corsair fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers. Together, they both outperformed and outnumbered their Japanese opponents. The Navy's first targets were the Japanese garrisons on the coral atolls of Tarawa and Makin in the Gilbert Islands. These were close to some of the most important supply routes across the Pacific. For a week, the atolls were bombed by carrier-based aircraft. Then, on November the 20th, 1943, there was an amphibious landing. Makin was captured with little difficulty. But Tarawa was a different story. Reconnaissance had failed to reveal that the water was too shallow for the landing craft. As the Marines waded ashore, they came under intense fire. The island was honeycombed with fortified machine gun nests. US troops who made it to dry land were pinned down on the beach. By the end of the day, over 1,500 of the 5,000 US Marines landed had been killed or severely injured. Over the next 2 days, frontal assaults pushed the Japanese back inch by inch. Very often, only flamethrowers could eliminate the Japanese strongpoints. It took 3 days before the last pocket of Japanese resistance was wiped out. Of the 4,200 Japanese troops on the island, only 17 were captured alive. Tarawa was a terrible forerunner of what was to come. The Japanese had shown that there would be no question of surrender. They would fight to the death. It was a grim prospect. In January 1944, America's naval offensive in the Pacific moved on to the Marshall Islands. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the U.S. naval commander in the Central Pacific, was anxious to avoid another bloodbath. So, aircraft from his carrier force bombed Japanese airfields on the islands for nearly 2 months. Finally, on February the 1st, 1944, he sent in the assault forces. The flat and open island of Roy was quickly overrun. But the islands of Kwajalein and Namur were wooded, and the Japanese resisted fanatically. US forces used flamethrowers and explosives. The Japanese responded by launching suicidal banzai charges. But the US forces now knew what to expect. The Japanese were beaten back. Over 8,000 Japanese soldiers died, for the loss of less than 400 US lives. Atoll after atoll in the Marshall Islands now fell to the US advance. Kwajalein was followed by Atoll. The island of Truk was bypassed and cut off. Though a small Japanese garrison would remain undefeated until the end of the war. The way was now clear for the next push, 1,000 miles west towards the Mariana Islands. If captured, the islands would put the Japanese mainland within range of US heavy bombers. They would also enable America to block Japan's supply lines from Southeast Asia. On June 11, 1944, the US started to soften up the 3 main islands in the Marianas. Four days later, Marines stormed the beaches of the northerly island of Saipan. This time, the terrain was mountainous, with many caves, and the preliminary bombardment had not disrupted the Japanese defenses as much as had been hoped. Nevertheless, by the end of the day, the American bridgehead was secure. In Tokyo, the news caused mounting alarm. The Japanese High Command now sent a carrier fleet to rescue the situation and save the Marianas. But the task force was spotted by US submarines. The Americans sent their main carrier force to intercept the Japanese. On the morning of June the 19th, 1944, the Japanese launched airstrikes against the US ships. But US radar saw them coming. "450 fighters were scrambled to intercept the Japanese planes. It turned into the largest aircraft carrier battle ever fought. The US task force had 15 aircraft carriers and more than 900 aircraft. Ranged against it, the Japanese had 9 carriers and nearly 500 aircraft. But Japan had lost many of its experienced air crews during the Solomon and Marshall Islands campaigns. Its novice pilots faced battle-hardened US flyers. The Japanese were outgunned and outfought. It would go down in history as the great Marianas turkey shoot. Half an hour into the battle, a torpedo from a US submarine hit the newest and largest Japanese carrier, the Taiho, while she was still launching aircraft. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had claimed its first major victim. At around the same time, another US submarine torpedoed the carrier Shokaku. She was completely destroyed. Nevertheless, the Japanese commander decided to continue with the operation, hoping to stop further US landings in the Marianas. For much of the following day, the US forces tried to pin down the exact location of the remaining Japanese carriers.
Bearing 096.
It took them until the afternoon to find them. It was late in the day to launch an attack, and the aircraft would have to fly at the limit of their range. But the US Task Force commander, Admiral Mark Mitcher, decided to gamble and attack. A third Japanese carrier, the Hayo, was hit and sunk. The Japanese had lost over 300 aircraft. But as the US planes now returned, dangerously short of fuel, they ran into a problem. In the gathering darkness, they couldn't find their own carriers. Many ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the sea. Mitcher, in an act of extraordinary courage, ordered his carriers to switch on their lights to guide in the returning aircraft. Fortunately for the Americans, there were no Japanese submarines to see them. Nevertheless, over 80 US planes were lost, either through having to ditch in the sea or through crashing while they landed. But Japanese losses had been even greater. 3 carriers and most of the aircraft needed to equip its remaining carrier fleet were gone. From now on, the United States Navy would dominate the Pacific, striking when and where it wanted.
Off the coast of Guadalcanal, a Pacific island in the Solomon's chain, there is a graveyard of American and Japanese warships. They were sunk in a savage 6-month battle. Their resting place is known as Iron Bottom Sound. At sea, in the air, and on land, the struggle for Guadalcanal began a campaign which was to test the endurance and fighting skills of the US Navy and Marine Corps to the very limit. It began with an unopposed American landing and the capture of a vital airfield. Then it turned into a slogging match at sea and in the jungle as the Japanese poured in reinforcements to reclaim this vital link in their Pacific perimeter. As dawn broke on the 7th of August 1942, the Allied South Pacific Amphibious Force approached Guadalcanal. Witness to their arrival was Martin Clemens, a member of a remarkable organization, the Coast Watchers. They were a group of Australian and British traders and planters who had stayed behind when the Japanese overran the Pacific. Clemens and colleagues like Henry Jocelyn reported enemy naval and air movements on the bulky radio sets with which they had been provided. The Coast Watchers and their Melanesian assistants formed a unique observation screen running from the border of Dutch New Guinea to the New Hebrides. The Coast Watchers were on the lookout for Japanese ships and aircraft, and the Japanese were on the lookout for them. Japanese patrols using bloodhounds offered large rewards for information which led to the capture of the vigilant Coast Watchers. The Coast Watchers were not the only secret organization watching the Japanese. At Station Hypo on Hawaii, US Navy cryptanalysts were reading the Japanese naval code JN-25 on a regular basis. But it was Martin Clemens who, in May 1942, had signaled the Allies that the Japanese were building an airfield on Guadalcanal. If the Japanese were allowed to complete the airfield, they would seize control of the skies in the area and menace the sea routes between the United States and Australia. The Americans had no option but to deny Guadalcanal to the Japanese. Martin Clemens' dramatic message had set the scene for one of the epic sea-air-land battles of the Pacific War. It would be a fight to the finish. The conflict in the Pacific had begun disastrously for the Americans when, without declaring war, the Japanese launched carrier-borne aircraft against the naval base at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had sunk or disabled 7 of the 8 battleships berthed at Pearl Harbor. But the US Pacific Fleet's carriers were at sea and escaped destruction. Before Pearl Harbor, the commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Admiral Yamamoto, had warned Emperor Hirohito that if Japan went to war with the United States, he could guarantee only 6 months of victory. Yamamoto knew the United States well and had a healthy respect for the untapped power of American industry. When this was converted to the waging of war, it could become an unstoppable force. Only the destruction of the US Pacific Fleet and its vital aircraft carriers could buy Japan the time it needed to secure the vast Pacific perimeter won in the first 6 months of the war. Yamamoto planned to lure the Pacific Fleet into a decisive encounter with an attack on the American-held island of Midway, which was equidistant from the Japanese home islands and Pearl Harbor. Midway was the keyhole through which American warships could still pass. In April 1942, it had admitted the American carrier Hornet, which had launched an air raid on the Japanese home islands led by Colonel James Doolittle. The American bombers had inflicted little damage on Japanese war industry, but several of them had flown directly over the Imperial Palace. They had orders not to drop bombs, but the implicit threat to the life of the Emperor, whom the Japanese regarded as divine, had a seismic effect on their military high command. It decided to close the Midway keyhole once and for all. The plans for the capture of Midway, until then the subject of heated debate in the Imperial Navy, were approved and brought forward. Yamamoto was confident of success. Victory at Midway would tighten the Japanese grip on their Pacific Empire. At this stage in the war, the Japanese were in the grip of what they would later call victory disease. The colonial powers in the Far East, the Dutch and the British and their American ally, had been humbled. The British had been driven out of Malaya and Singapore and then bundled back across the Indian border. All this had been achieved at remarkably little cost to the Japanese. In the Philippines, the Americans had suffered a humiliating defeat. Fatally underestimated by their European and American enemies, the Japanese imperial forces had proved masters of war on land, sea and air. They stood at the gates of India, and their bombers had raided the port of Darwin in Australia's Northern Territory. The Japanese seemed to hold all the cards. But the Americans had the most important card of all up their sleeve. The breaking of JN-25 had given the American codebreakers a ringside seat at the formulation of Japanese strategy. The decryption of coded naval signals had revealed Japanese plans to strike at Port Moresby in New Guinea, so as to complete their conquest of the island. The commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, dispatched the carriers Lexington and Yorktown to position themselves in the Coral Sea, so as to intercept any Japanese forces attacking Port Moresby. The Japanese invasion force from Rabaul was covered by 3 aircraft carriers. On the 8th of May, each side located the other's carrier forces. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the first carrier versus carrier battle in naval history. Lexington was set ablaze by a leak in her aviation fuel lines and had to be abandoned. But the Americans hit back by disabling the Japanese carrier Shokaku. Tactically, the battle was a victory for the Japanese. However, they were forced to abandon their attempt to seize Port Moresby, and the threat to Australia was removed. The battle also convinced the American carrier force that it was the equal of the Japanese. The Japanese now put their Midway plan, codenamed MI, into action. A diversionary attack was to be launched against the Aleutians in the north, while the Japanese First Air Fleet, commanded by Admiral Nagumo, concentrated against Midway. Meanwhile, the battered Yorktown underwent hasty repairs at Pearl Harbor before rejoining Task Force 17 under the command of Admiral Frank J. Fletcher. Admiral Fletcher was a cautious commander who was only too aware of the need to safeguard America's small but vital carrier fleet. Yorktown sailed to join Hornet and Enterprise, which formed the core of Task Force 16, under the command of Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. At this stage in his career, Spruance was inexperienced in carrier warfare. Both Spruance and Fletcher knew that the odds were stacked against them. The Japanese First Air Fleet fielded 6 large carriers, of which 4 had been allocated to the Midway operation. When battle was joined, 180 American aircraft would face 270 Japanese. for all the emerging fighting skills of the American carriers and their air groups, these were daunting odds. The equalizer in this equation was the American access to the Japanese naval code JN-25. Nevertheless, in the opening moves of the Midway campaign, Japanese radio security gave little away. The operation itself was designated MI, which might have meant anything, in spite of the implied reference to Midway Island. In the Japanese plan, Midway itself, little more than an atoll with a small marine garrison supported by an air component, was designated AF. The man in charge of Station Hypo, the brilliant cryptanalyst Commander Joseph Rochefort, was convinced that Midway was the target. But U.S. Fleet Commander-in-Chief Admiral Ernest J. King believed that the First Air Fleet was about to strike at the west coast of America. So Rochefort decided to set a trap. On a secure telegraphic link, he instructed the American garrison on Midway to radio in clear that it was running out of fresh water. The Japanese swallowed the bait. Shortly after Midway had requested fresh supplies of water, an Australian antenna of Rochefort's network intercepted a Japanese cipher transmission which indicated that AF had reported that it was short of water. Rochefort's ruse had revealed the target. Subsequent intercepts indicated that the operation designated MI would start on the 4th of June. The American carriers were in position to intercept the First Air Fleet when it launched its attack on Midway. The Japanese were to be taken completely by surprise. They thought the enemy carriers were on the other side of the Pacific. The first Japanese strike on the island failed to destroy all its targets. The aircraft returned to their carriers to refuel, rearm, and complete their task. But then the fate of the Imperial Japanese Navy was decided within the space of exactly 5 minutes on the morning of the 4th of June 1942. In those fatal 5 minutes, dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown and Enterprise found, attacked and destroyed 3 of the First Air Fleet's carriers. The First Air Fleet had ceased to exist. With the carriers went the Japanese dream of empire. The Japanese struck back. Aircraft from their surviving carrier, Hiryu, disabled Yorktown. The carrier was abandoned and later sunk by a Japanese submarine. But Hiryu did not survive for long. As dusk approached, she too was found and wrecked by American dive and torpedo bombers. Yamamoto's prophecy of 6 months of victory had been fulfilled almost to the day. But Yamamoto knew that the Japanese losses could never be made good. The initiative now lay with the Americans. Although they had not lost a single foot of territory, the Japanese would now be forced to defend a vast ocean empire which might be attacked at any point by the gathering might of the American war machine. The Americans had to choose the axis along which to advance. To reach Japan's home islands, they could either strike in the south through the Solomons, New Guinea and the Philippines, or they could mount a drive through the Central Pacific aimed at the island of Okinawa. But between the home islands and the American jumping-off points lay a daunting chain of Japanese-held island fortresses, blocking an amphibious advance. The choice of route depended on agreement between the Navy commander in the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz, and General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the Army forces in the Southwest Pacific with his headquarters in Australia. The choice of a northern route to Japan would increase the importance of the Navy at the expense of MacArthur. But the small Marine Corps was Nimitz's only military arm. Nor had the Navy yet developed the specialist assault craft and fleet trains to send it striding across the Pacific. In contrast, the Army had the men who were arriving in numbers in Australia. The route through the southwest Pacific, with a jumping-off point near Australia, would carry the army through larger islands, yielding some of the resources needed to sustain the offensive. This route would also need less of the presently overstretched shipping services. But the southern route would emphasize the army's role at the expense of the navy, and the brilliant but overbearing MacArthur was not popular with the naval high command. They feared that in these circumstances he would usurp the overall direction of strategy. At the beginning of July, after much haggling, a compromise was reached. The initial emphasis would be on the southern route, but the area would be subdivided, giving certain parts to MacArthur and the army, and others to Nimitz and the navy. MacArthur would have only a limited call on the navy's carriers and bombardment fleet. Uncharacteristically, he would have to take a back seat for Task 1, which was the capture of Guadalcanal by the navy. Guadalcanal could be safely approached from New Zealand, the starting point for the operation, codenamed Watchtower. But it was surrounded on three sides by other islands in the Solomons Group. Together they formed a cramped channel which was to become known to the Americans as the Slot. Once the Marines had been landed on Guadalcanal, the Navy would have to resupply them through the dangerous waters of the Slot. The Slot was to claim many American and Japanese lives. The commander of the Marine Corps landing force assigned to Watchtower, General Alexander A. Vandergrift, was under no illusions about the difficulties of the task which lay ahead. His force of 18,000 men consisted largely of raw troops. He had only 2 months in which to prepare. And his naval escorts had little or no experience of amphibious operations. The men nicknamed the venture Operation Shoestring. There was another problem. On the eve of the Battle of Midway, the Japanese switched to a new code, JN-25C. Station Hypo was plunged into the dark. While the codebreakers struggled to break into JN-25C, they had to rely on traffic analysis. By studying the volume and frequency selection of Japanese radio traffic, the Americans could draw general conclusions about the activity of the enemy's armed forces. They could also identify the distinctive fists, or keying styles, of individual Japanese signalers. Traffic analysis could not offer the dramatic insights provided by JN-25 decrypts, but it was vital work nonetheless. In July 1942, traffic analysis was providing early and alarming evidence that the Japanese were preparing to mount a campaign in the South Pacific. Heavy air reinforcements were arriving in the area. As the Americans prepared, there was a sharp increase in enemy convoy activity, and Japanese radio traffic indicated that a powerful cruiser force was being deployed in the Guadalcanal area. The Americans set out from New Zealand without adequate maps of the landing areas. D-Day was set for the 7th of August. The Japanese had their own traffic analysis program, and the new area commander, Admiral Mikawa, based in Rabaul, was concerned about the changing pattern of American signals. But his subordinates dismissed the suggestion that the Americans were about to land in Guadalcanal. On the 7th of August, the men of the 1st Marine Division waded ashore on Tulagi and Guadalcanal, just a few miles east of the Japanese airfield. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese had been taken by surprise. The landings were unopposed. This was fortunate, since the beaches rapidly descended into chaos as men, munitions and stores arrived in completely haphazard fashion. But on Tulagi, and nearby Tanambogo and Gavutu, the Americans ran into furious opposition from the Japanese garrisons. It was an ominous sign of things to come. It took a fearsome bombardment from the task force warships to drive the defenders from their positions. Within 36 hours, the Marines had taken the Japanese airfield, which was renamed Henderson Field after a Marine pilot who had died at Midway. For the next 6 months, the battle for Guadalcanal would boil down to the battle for Henderson Field. The Marines would soon be deprived of the air cover provided by Fletcher's carriers. Anxious about the losses his fighter force had already sustained, Fletcher decided to withdraw his ships. These included Saratoga, Wasp, and Enterprise. Fletcher was backed by Admiral Richmond K. Turner, the amphibious force commander, who had also decided to pull out. Vandergrift and the Marines were now left on Guadalcanal on their own. They dug in around Henderson Field to await the inevitable Japanese counterattack. By mid-afternoon on the 7th of August, a force of 7 Japanese cruisers, commanded by Mikawa, was racing towards Guadalcanal. The encoded signal ordering Mikawa to sail from Rabaul had been intercepted, but was not deciphered for another week. The Americans had lost their intelligence edge. For their part, the Japanese were supremely confident. Lacking radar, they were trained to fight night actions with their long-lance torpedoes. Mikawa's objective was the American transports lying in Iron Bottom Sound. His cruiser force attacked south of Savo Island, avoiding 2 U.S. destroyers patrolling the approaches. The U.S.-Australian naval force under the Royal Navy's Admiral Crutchley was divided into a southern group of 3 cruisers, and a northern group, also of 3 cruisers, positioned to screen both possible approaches. Crutchley, however, was attending a conference to discuss the withdrawal of the carriers. He had not informed his senior captain that he was now in command of the screening force. His flagship, the cruiser Canberra, was only minutes away from disaster. When Mikawa rounded Savo Island and encountered the Allied southern group, the result was fatal confusion. Illuminated by Japanese flares, Canberra was hit by a hail of gunfire. Then Chicago was raked by fire and hit by a long-lance torpedo. In less than 10 furious minutes, Mikawa had put the southern screening group out of action. Somehow, Canberra remained afloat until the next morning, when her crew were taken off. She was then sent to the bottom by a torpedo fired by an American destroyer. The battered Chicago lived to fight another day. Mikawa then turned his attention to the cruisers in the northern group, Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria. The Japanese force now split into 2 columns, steering northeast towards the still unprepared US ships. In less than 3/4 of an hour, Mikawa's force sank Vincennes and Quincy and crippled Astoria. Only the cruiser Australia now stood between Mikawa and the transports. But fearing attacks from American carrier-borne aircraft at first light, he did not press on. This proved to be one of the most fateful decisions of the Guadalcanal campaign, and one which earned Mikawa the personal censure of Admiral Yamamoto. the defeat suffered at the hands of Mikawa was too much for the commander of Crutchley's southern group, Captain Howard D. Bode, who later committed suicide. Meanwhile, the Marines consolidated their positions around Henderson Field. The first aircraft, 12 Dauntless dive bombers and 19 Wildcat fighters, arrived on the 20th of August. The Japanese High Command had not yet grasped the seriousness of the threat posed by the Marines on Guadalcanal. They launched an unsupported battalion strength attack on Henderson Field. This was beaten off with heavy losses. The Japanese commander committed harakiri. The Japanese infantry had been landed on Guadalcanal by ships commanded by Admiral Tanaka. This was the first in a long succession of runs which the Americans were to dub the Tokyo Express. By now, the Japanese had switched codes again, moving on to JN-25D on the 14th of August. They were also planning another run of the Tokyo Express, but this time as part of an elaborate trap set for the Pacific Fleet by no less a person than Admiral Yamamoto. Independent of the Express, but coordinated with it, would sail a powerful striking force of battleships, cruisers and destroyers, escorting the carriers Zuikaku and Shokaku. As the transport group approached north of the Solomons, a diversionary group led by the carrier Ryujo went ahead. This was intended to lure Admiral Frank Fletcher's Task Force 61 into revealing itself, so that it could be destroyed by aircraft from Yamamoto's powerful striking force. On the 24th of August, Ryujo was duly sighted by Admiral Fletcher's task force patrolling east of the Solomons. Dive bombers from Enterprise sent the light carrier to the bottom. Now Fletcher's force braced itself for the enemy response. He had dispatched the strike which sank Ryujo with no fighter escort. Overhead, he had 53 fighters stacked in 3 layers, waiting for the attack he knew must come. All Fletcher's remaining dive and torpedo bomber crews had taken off to find and attack the Japanese fleet. Saratoga and Enterprise waited, every gun manned and loaded. When the Japanese aircraft arrived, the American fighters beat off the enemy torpedo bombers and their escorts. But about 30 dive bombers arrived undetected over Enterprise. She was hit by 3 bombs, 2 of which crashed into the carrier's vitals before exploding. Enterprise lay dead in the water for some time before limping off to safety. Meanwhile, aircraft from Saratoga had hit and badly damaged the seaplane carrier Chitose. The next day, Marine Corps aircraft flying from Henderson Field attacked Tanaka's transports and hit his flagship Jinsu. Henceforth, the Tokyo Express would only run at night. Japanese dive bombers hit back at the American convoys. Both sides were now raising the stakes in the battle for Guadalcanal, striving to land reinforcements while choking off the enemy's attempts to do the same. On Guadalcanal itself, fighting raged around a ridge 1 mile southwest of Henderson Field, soon to be dubbed Bloody Ridge. nightly runs of the Tokyo Express fed in more Japanese reinforcements, and warships shelled the marine positions around Henderson Field. Vandergrift was beginning to lose the numbers war on Guadalcanal. The Americans stepped up their own reinforcement runs, and on the 15th of September, the battleship North Carolina formed part of the escort for a convoy bringing in 4,000 men of the 7th Marines. The troops were landed safely, but on the way out, the convoy's other major element, the carrier Wasp, was torpedoed and sunk by a Japanese submarine. By the end of September, the Japanese High Command had finally grasped the importance of the battle for Guadalcanal. They also kept a grip on their signal security. They rang the changes on JN-25 and began a wholesale overhaul of their communication system. The American codebreakers, who'd been feeling their way back into JN-25, were once again forced to rely on traffic analysis. Conditions on Guadalcanal were appalling. The landing beaches clogged with the detritus of war. The fetid jungle alive with leeches and disease. The Japanese resolve to wrest Guadalcanal from the Marines was confirmed on the 9th of October with the arrival on the island of the commander of 17th Army, General Hyakutake, to take personal charge of the campaign. Meanwhile, the Americans continued to run in reinforcements, provoking furious clashes in the waters around Guadalcanal. More victims for Iron Bottom Sound. On the night of the 11th of October, the Americans and the Japanese made simultaneous landings on Guadalcanal. This led to another night battle west of Savo Island. A heavy cruiser task force commanded by Admiral Norman Scott took the Japanese by surprise. At the end of a confused and bitterly fought encounter, Scott was able to claim victory, proof that the Japanese were no longer invincible by night. Exploiting his advantage in radar, Scott had been able to maul the escort accompanying the Tokyo Express. In the dark, the Americans were no longer all at sea, although they lost a destroyer and one of Scott's heavy cruisers was badly battered. But Scott had not prevented the landing of the Japanese reinforcements, which included artillery. The struggle for Guadalcanal was nearing a new crisis. Henderson Field now came under bombardment from land and from the 14-inch guns of the battleships Congo and Haruna, cruising in Iron Bottom Sound. Meanwhile, the American codebreakers were back in business. In mid-October, they warned of a fresh concentration of Japanese transports, cruisers and carriers in the Solomons area. At the same time, the Japanese ground strength on the island matched that of the Marines. The fresh Japanese offensive, launched on the 24th of October, nearly broke through to Henderson Field. At one point, all that stood between the Japanese and Henderson Field was a single machine gun, manned by Sergeant John Basilone of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. It was enough to deny the Japanese their prize. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz was keenly aware that the Navy had not secured the waters around Guadalcanal. He warned his staff that he wanted no gloom or defeatism. Nimitz declared that the enemy is hurt too, but our job is to provide the fighting men with everything they need on Guadalcanal to fight this battle. We aren't going to do any good sitting here moaning or wringing our hands. The hard-driving Admiral William Bull Halsey was appointed C&C South Pacific. Fletcher, who'd been wounded in action, was replaced by Admiral Thomas Kincaid. By now, virtually the entire Japanese combined fleet, 5 carriers, 4 battleships, 10 cruisers and 29 destroyers, had sailed southward from Truk for a colossal bombardment and blockade operation. American cryptanalysts intensified their warnings of another Japanese offensive, although they could not pinpoint the precise date and location of the thrust. But Guadalcanal seemed to be the most likely objective. The main Japanese fleet was now deployed north of the Solomons. In Yamamoto's words, his warships were waiting to apprehend and annihilate any powerful forces in the area. Yamamoto again exercised overall command from the giant battleship Yamato at Truk in the Carolines group of islands. While the fighting swung to and fro around Henderson Field, the Japanese twice postponed the offensive. But time was running out for Yamamoto. The Japanese delay enabled the newly repaired Enterprise to complete the voyage from Pearl Harbor. She rendezvoused with Kincaid's task force and the carrier Hornet to patrol northeast of the Santa Cruz Islands. Bearing down on them were a Japanese advance force tasked with attacking Henderson Field, and a powerful striking force of 3 large carriers under Admiral Nagumo, with orders to locate and destroy the American carriers. The scene was set for a potentially decisive carrier battle. After reconnaissance planes from both fleets had located their targets, the Japanese and American strike forces took off. Incredibly, the 2 strike forces passed within sight of each other. A handful of Japanese fighters peeled off to engage their American counterparts, but the rest flew on towards their distant targets. Shortly after 9 a.m., the Americans attacked the enemy carriers. There were direct hits on Shakaku and Zuiho. The Japanese escorts also came under fire. Within 10 minutes, the Americans were also under attack. Hornet was hit by bombs and torpedoes, and in a sinister new development, the carrier was also the target of 2 Japanese suicide planes. The second enemy wave scored more hits on Enterprise. A third damaged the cruiser San Juan. Enterprise was still able to take on aircraft, and Kincaid decided to break off the action. The battleship South Dakota had also been hit by Japanese aircraft, but lived to fight another day. Hornet had not been so lucky. Now a wreck, she was abandoned and sunk the next day by Japanese destroyers. The Japanese had won a tactical victory, but they could not afford many more like it. They had lost 97 aircraft and 148 irreplaceable aircrew, including a high proportion of veteran squadron and section commanders. The Americans could afford their losses, but Admiral Nagumo's dead airmen were gone forever. But the Japanese were not prepared to concede defeat on Guadalcanal. In the first 2 weeks of November, their destroyers ran in thousands more troops. Now they outnumbered the Marines on the island. Traffic analysis and the fitful breaking of JN-25 had once again painted a partial picture of Japanese intentions. The Americans steeled themselves to face another maximum enemy effort. Yamamoto planned another action at sea to coincide with a drive by his land forces on Henderson Field, now littered with wrecked aircraft, but still defiantly operational. Yamamoto issued his orders on the 8th of November. Within 24 hours, they had been largely decoded and were on the desk of Admiral Halsey. The Americans now anticipated a renewed assault on Guadalcanal and a drive on Henderson Field on the 12th of November. Halsey was given more details on the 10th, but he didn't know the size of Yamamoto's force, nor was he aware of Yamamoto's plans to bombard Henderson Field. The bulletin issued by Halsey on the 10th of November stated, "Big Japanese offensive against Guadalcanal to begin soon. Believe enemy striking force intends to hit that place, followed by attempted landings by army units from transports." At sea, Admiral Kondo, flying his flag in the heavy cruiser Atago, commanded a formidable advance force of 2 battleships, 6 cruisers, and 21 destroyers. They were accompanied by a bombardment group of 2 battleships, a light cruiser, and destroyers, and another support group drawn from 8th Fleet of cruisers and destroyers. Bearing down on Guadalcanal was a far larger force than the Americans anticipated. But in one vital respect, the Japanese were under strength. 3 carriers were on their way back to the home islands for repairs and fresh air crews. Only the carrier Junyo was at sea with Kondo. Halsey was in no better shape. He had only 1 carrier, Enterprise, undergoing repairs in New Caledonia, the battleships Washington and South Dakota, 8 cruisers, and 22 destroyers. But Halsey had no intention of avoiding battle. He ordered Kincaid to sail on the 11th of November and be prepared to strike at enemy targets in the Guadalcanal area. Kondo's fleet positioned itself 150 miles north of Guadalcanal. The bombardment force was dispatched to shell Henderson Field, while Admiral Tanaka landed reinforcements at Tasafaronga Point, northwest of the American beachhead. On the night of the 12th of November, the bombardment force collided head-on with the Americans in Iron Bottom Sound, southeast of Savo Island. Another night battle ensued. Admiral Scott, aboard his flagship Atlanta, was killed, along with most of his senior commanders, when a shell from the battleship Hiei smashed into Atlanta's bridge. San Francisco's bridge was raked with fire by Kirishima, claiming the life of Admiral Callahan. Meanwhile, 8 American destroyers had joined a deadly duel with Hiei, closing to a range at which the battleship could not bring its heavy guns to bear. Hit more than 50 times, Hiei limped away. Kirishima also withdrew. The Japanese later scuttled Hiei, the first of their battleships to go down in the war. At sunset on the 14th of November, the American battleships Washington and South Dakota intercepted the 2nd Japanese force under Admiral Kondo as it sailed eastward through the Solomon Sea to bombard Henderson Field. Long Lance torpedoes put 3 of the Americans' 4 destroyer escorts out of action. Then Kirishima crippled South Dakota. Moving in for the kill, Kirishima was engaged by Washington at a range of 5 miles. Washington opened fire by radar. Hit by a succession of broadsides, Kirishima was set ablaze and abandoned. Kondo, in the cruiser Tagao, sailed away at full speed. Meanwhile, Kinkaid's task force, including the wounded Enterprise, was heading north to engage Tanaka's convoy. Carrier-borne aircraft sank 7 of the Japanese transports. When the 4 survivors were grounded at Tassafaronga the next day, they were pounded by American dive bombers and artillery. The Tokyo Express had been derailed. Despite the American threat, the Express continued to mount operations. At the end of November, 8 destroyers crammed with troops got the better of a strong American cruiser force, but was unable to land any reinforcements. The American grip on the approaches to Guadalcanal was now tightening. The Japanese had lost none of their flair for night fighting, but the Americans had climbed a steep learning curve to match them in this deadly game. The Japanese now resorted to submarines to run in supplies to 17th Army. In the first week of December, they delivered 20 tons, a drop in the ocean. But once again, radio intelligence came to the aid of the Americans, giving advance warning of many of the submarine runs. On the 9th of December, radio intercepts enabled the Americans to arrange a PT boat ambush. 2 PT boats lay in wait for the submarine I-3, which obligingly surfaced between them and was sunk with a single torpedo. Victory on Guadalcanal was in sight. The Americans now held the upper hand at sea and in the air. A trickle of Japanese prisoners were giving themselves up. Many starving Japanese were killed by native villagers. Their severed heads decorated the island's longhouses for years to come. Vandergrift's battle-worn Marines were replaced by U.S. Army troops under the command of General Alexander M. Patch. Patch began to mop up. Vandergrift's dogged defense of Henderson Field had turned him into a national hero. The jealous MacArthur sourly remarked that the Marine commander clearly wanted to run for president. At their last gasp, the Japanese scored a final success. At the end of January 1943, Japanese aircraft flying from Rabaul attacked an American decoy reinforcement convoy heading for Guadalcanal in the hope of drawing Yamamoto into another battle. A torpedo sank Chicago, the sole survivor of the Battle of Savo Island. By the end of the first week in February, the Japanese had evacuated 13,000 troops from Guadalcanal. Behind them, they left 25,000 dead and barely 1,000 prisoners. On the 9th of February 1943, General Patch signaled Halsey, "The Tokyo Express no longer has a terminal." Thus began the American fightback, which was to end 3 years later in Tokyo Bay with the Japanese surrender. And today, divers still explore the secrets of Guadalcanal in the underwater cemetery in Iron Bottom Sound.